Okay, now I want to talk with you about cloning. So we have the shot here of the ship floating into the glowing moon. And what I want to do here is create a light wrap around the ship and the wave. In order to do a light wrap, you have to pre-comp your foreground layers and your background layers so they're fit to the comp size. And then you can create a light wrap from that. However, that can be kind of difficult because in this case, for example, I have a 3D camera here and a null object that this is parented to. So I'd have to put that into both pre-comps. But let's say I want to change something, add a new null object to it or something. So I'd have to copy that as well into every of these pre-comps. So yeah, it can be kind of a tedious, annoying process. And pre-comp clones are supposed to solve that. So you don't lose your layers, you can work in your existing pre-comp, and you can update all changes automatically. So how do you do that? First, let's just select the layers we want. So I have this ship here and I have this wave. So I come up with the menu and go to clone and precomp. And I don't want the prime clone enabled and I don't want the precomp transforms to be enabled. And I'll show you later what these parameters mean. So hit OK. And now we see that we have this merged result here. And if we look inside, we see that we have 4 layers here. We have our wave and our ship, as well as the camera and its parent. And if we look inside, we see that everything has been linked by expressions. So that means if I grab the ship here, for example, and I move it around, you see that it will move as well. Also, you can just disable your layers or enable them, and that's also linked by expression. Also, you can enable or disable your effects, and that will update as well. However, let's say you add an effect here, for example. This is not part of the clone because adding an effect cannot be linked by expression. So in that case, if you added some effect or changed a certain parameter that cannot be linked by expression, you would have to hit refresh connections. This is a different refresh than the refresh layout. So with either the clone selected or a layer that is contained in the clone, come up to the menu and go to refresh connections. And now, as you can see, these curves have been added, and if I change them, the layer will also react to that. Now I can, for example, add another effect, and then I would also have to hit refresh connections, and I can do that by using the shortcut, which is Control Alt and Q or Control Q on Mac. Now this effect has been added and I can play around with it. Let's say I want to change the effect structure. So I want to put that after that. However, if I look into the clone, this of course hasn't been changed because also changing the effects order cannot be linked by expression. So in that case, I would also have to hit refresh connections. And then as you can see, it is in the correct order. If you look into the user guide and you go to connections, you see under refresh connections and refreshing precomp clones, all parameters that cannot be linked by expression and that therefore you would have to hit refresh connections. Also, when you just add parents, for example, if I add a parent here and I parent my ship to that, now the position is completely off in the clone. But if I hit refresh connections again, everything is back to normal. And you see that this parent also has been added to the clone. The clone will collect all parents and also all layers that are referenced by an effect, for example. Like when you create a displacement map and you reference another layer, this will also be added to the clone automatically. Let's say I want to add more layers to this precomp clone. So if you come up to the effects on the precomp clone, you'll see that you have certain settings, and I'll get into those later. And you have these effects for every layer that is contained in the clone. And then you can just duplicate that effect. And then using the drop down, you can select this layer, for example. If you hit refresh connections, you see that this now has been added to the clone as well. Another way that is a faster way to add layers to a precomp clone is just if you select the layers you want to add. And after that, as the last layer, you select your Precomp clone. Then you come up to the menu and you hold on Control or you hold on Command on Mac and you click on Add Remove Layer References. And now, if we look into the clone, we see that all the other layers here have been added as well. You can also just use a shortcut to add layer references. Control Alt Shift I, or on Mac it's Control and I. You can delete layers again just by selecting them and delete the effect and then hit Refresh Connections. And now they're removed from the Precomp clone. Also, there are custom states for every layer. So I can go to the custom state, for example, of the ship here. And I can, for example, unlink the opacity and set it to 50. All right, let's say I want to duplicate this clone. So if I duplicate that and hit refresh connections on that one. And now if I look at the source name, you see that those are two different comps. So if you hit refresh connections, it will of course think that this is a new unique clone and then create a unique clone from that. And now I can of course just customize that. Let's say I just want to have my ship layer. I'm going to remove those. And now on this one, I only have the ship cloned, and on this one, I have all of the other layers cloned as well. But what if I want to duplicate a Precomp clone, but I don't want to make it a unique clone? Then I'm just going to duplicate that layer. And what I have to do then is then come up to all these effects here and just delete them. And now if I hit refresh layout, you see that the C, it will turn into a D, which means dependent clone. And this, of course, is just referencing this clone here. If I want to hit refresh connections on that one, it says that it doesn't have any reference layers. And now I can customize it whatever I want. Maybe I can drag it and do all kinds of manipulations to it. Now I still have this comp here, for example, this Precomp clone, and I don't need it anymore. So I, of course, just want to delete that. But let's say I'm just going to use the regular delete function. And if I'm going to do that, you see if I come up to my clones, you see that this one still exists here. And we also get an expression error. So you can also just use delete layer clone group, which we already covered in our group tutorial. So I can just use the shortcut for that, which is Shift Delete. And now the source of this clone also has been deleted. But let's say I just deleted that and I deleted a bunch of other Precomp clones because I, didn't notice I had to delete them, with the special delete function. And I'm getting a few expression errors. So what do you do then? You can come up to the settings, go to cloning, and it tells me that I have 2 unused Precomp clones. And then I can just go to delete Precomp clones. And now I want to clone our background layer. And all of that is contained within this background group. And instead of selecting all the layers I want to have contained, I can also create a group clone. So I can just use the shortcut to create a Precomp clone, which is Control, Alt, Shift, and W, or on Mac, it's Control and W. And I want to create a group clone, but I don't want the prime clone to be enabled. And now the background here has been cloned. However, this is a group clone, so it works differently. So let's say I have this layer here, and I want to add it to the Precomp clone. But it tells me that I cannot add layers to a group clone. So the way a group clone works is that it just grabs all of the contained layers in the group. Let's say I'm adding this layer now to this group, and then I hit refresh connections. Now it will be added automatically to the clone. I can also use delete layer clone group in this case. Then it will update the clone automatically and remove the layer from the clone. Otherwise, if I would just use the regular delete function, you will get an expression error there because this layer, of course, cannot be referenced anymore. Alright, this group clone layer always has to stay within the group itself. So if I would move it into the ship group, for example, and hit refresh connections, it will think it is a group clone from that group. But I want it, of course, to be the clone of the background layer. So I'm going to move it in there, hit refresh connections. So the clone will only grab layers that are below the clone layer. So let's say I'm adding a mat, for example. And I hit refresh connections. It will not collect this mat layer because it is on top of the group clone layer. So yeah, if you want to have your layer contained in the group clone, just put it below the group clone then. There's only one exception. If the group clone itself is a track mat, then the one layer below, the matted layer, won't be added to the group clone. I don't want to show that actually. I just want to use that background layer as a way to create a Lightwrap. But I want to, of course, I have to move it above the ship and everything else. But since I cannot move a group clone layer out of the group as I showed you, the way I want to do it is to just duplicate that and then just delete all the effects to make it a dependent clone and then move it up here. I'm going to disable the ship clone because I just want to use it, as a mat. I'm going to rename that quickly to Lightwrap and that to ship reference and just rename on dependency very quickly. And I'm just going to create a group here. Now I'm just going to quickly create the setup for a Lightwrap. And I'm going to use the ship as a mat. And I'm going to invert it, add a Gaussian blur to it, create a mat again. And now we have created our Lightwrap very quickly. And now, since everything is linked by expression, I can move all of my layers around. And as you can see, the Lightwrap will react to that automatically. So I have my camera here that's parented to this null object. Let's say I want to change some camera movement, so I want to add a new null to it and parent that null to that. Now, as you can see, the Lightwrap is totally out of whack because the transforms don't match anymore. So instead of just finding all of your Precomp clones and selecting them to update them, what you can also do is just deselect all layers and then hit refresh connections. And it will ask you whether you want to refresh all clones, and I want that. And now all clones have been updated with this new parent here. So this clone and this clone as well. Similarly, I can just remove it. And I will, of course, get the expression errors, and then I can hit refresh connections again. There's also a quicker way. There's also a function, if we come up to the menu and hold on Shift, called quick refresh connections. It's a much quicker way to refresh connections. However, there are some drawbacks to it. In a later tutorial, I'll show you how that works. So if I hit that, now this parent will be removed from all Precomp clones. Since everything is linked by expression, it can get a bit slow since expression take a bit of time to calculate. So there's also a way to not link these properties by expression. So let's say I have my clone here and I'm done, I'm finished. I know I don't want to work on that anymore. So I don't need them to be linked. I can also go to link properties via expressions, and I uncheck that and then hit refresh connections. And now if we go inside and look at our layers, we see there are no expressions. Just be aware, of course, if I, move that layer, it will not update when it's unlinked. And I can also just use the dedicated function, since it might take a bit of time to always, go to the layer, then go to this checkbox and hit refresh connections. You can also come up to the main panel, hold on Alt or Option, and click on Unlink Properties. And now everything is linked again. And of course, you can also use a shortcut for that, which is Control, Alt, Shift, and 0. If you want to, you can also change the layer order. So you can go to layer order and set it to custom order. And it works by just shifting these effects around. So I'm going to shift them, as I like, and then hit refresh connections. And as you can see now, the layer order has been changed. This can be, for example, useful if you want to create an alpha matte using a Precomp clone. And there's also the possibility to set the blending mode individually, for example, to stencil alpha or to silhouette alpha, and build your custom matte. So what happens to clones when you duplicate your comp? If I want all of these clones to be unique clones, I can just have no layer selected, hit refresh connections, hit OK. And now unique clones have been created here. And as you can see, you have your ship reference and your background group clone, and it tells you that this is in ShotComp 2. If you don't want to have unique clones, but you want dependent clones, just go to the Precomp clones and delete your effects on there, then hit refresh layout. And now all of these, as you can see, are dependent clones. All right, now I want to show you a different kind of cloning, which is called prime clones. So I have this glass group here. So I have some stripes, structure here, and the glass texture. And both are 3D layers that are tracked into the shot. And now I want to add some drops to it. So I have this texture here of these drops that are also tracked into the shot. And I have my main footage here. And I added a bit of color correction to it. And now I want to create a bump map from this drops texture onto that, so that the background kind of, shines through these drops. However, since this isn't at comp dimension, it won't be able to reference that, so we have to pre-comp that. However, compared to the pre-comp clones we saw before, this time I don't want this layer to appear within the shot other than from the pre-comp layer itself. So if I go to clone layer, I can enable the prime clone on this one, and I'm going to hit OK. And you already see that it looks a bit different. The contained layer now has this dot in front of it. And every of the layers that have this dot, they are contained within a prime clone. And let me just reveal the opacity. So we see that the contained layer has an opacity of 0, and the clone layer has an opacity of 100. However, we obviously still see this texture, and we can control the opacity via this slider up here. And you already see I can dial it up or down. And although the opacity is set at 0% here, if we look into the clone, it will have the opacity that we defined right here. This has the advantage that I'm seeing what the clone sees, but since the layer also is still enabled, I can move it around. And remember, the only thing we're seeing right now is the clone layer. Let me just create the bump map now. So I'm using CC Glass for it, and I'm going to reference the drops texture. Alright, now we're already getting like a very drop-like effect here. Now I'm just going to duplicate that drops texture, make it a dependent clone, and use it as a track matte for that layer. Rename it. Okay, now I want to lighten this part here because there's, light coming through the window here. So what I'm going to do is create an adjustment layer. And then I'm going to create a matte for the window area here and grab the transforms of that layer here. Now I'm just going to mask it. But I also want to use these drops here as a second alpha. And for that, I'm going to use another function, which I'm going to talk about later, which is merge mattes. And with that, we can merge several mats into one track mat. I'm just going to speed up this part because we're going to talk about it later anyway. Now everything is matted and I can add curves to it here. And now I'm just brightening that area here. Alright, one thing I want to do now is create a camera lens blur to the whole group here. So how am I going to do that? You can stack your prime clones on top of each other. So we have this one prime clone here, but we can potentially stack this indefinitely. So we can, for example, select all of the layers, and I'm going to go to clone, enable the prime clone, hit OK. Let's get this to screen. Now, as you can see, all of these contained layers have this dot here, and the one from the drops texture is indented even further, which shows that it's one level deeper. And you can stack your prime clones. You can, if you want to, you can also clone that again and stack these clones on top of each other. I don't want to use that. In fact, I actually want to use a group clone in that case. So I'm going to delete that for now. Create a clone here, enable prime clone, set this to screen, and I can add a camera lens blur here. Alright, now we have added a camera lens blur to all of the contained layers. And the cool thing, even with this camera lens blur here on top of it, is I can, move all of the layers around. So for example, I want to change the drops texture here, and everything will update in all the higher clones as well. Or I can, shift the window area here around. And this is so much better than having to go through levels and levels of pre-comps and changing something, then not knowing how it works, in the higher comps and all of that stuff. So let's say I want to change the opacity of that brightening here, for example. Of course, if I'm gonna hit T, I can't change it because it's set to 0. So every time I'd have to come up to the effects panel and change it up here. There's also a quicker way though. If you want the slider to be revealed in the timeline, you can also hit a shortcut, which is Alt F1 or Control 3 on Mac. And then you can set it to 50 or, 75 or something. With a layer that is not a prime clone source layer, it will just reveal the regular opacity slider. If I want to add an effect, for example, to a contained layer here, and I'm going to create curves, and I want to change something, of course, we don't see anything right now because it is not part of the clone layer. So I have to hit refresh connections, and then it will update. However, if you're working on your clone layers, this can be sometimes a bit annoying, always having to hit refresh connections. So there's also a different way on how to work on it. On the clone layer, you can come up to the settings and click on show layers. And if I hit refresh layout, we now see the original source layers. So the clone layer here is set to 0% opacity, and the contained layers, as you can see, are set to their actual opacity here. What you can also do is hit Control Shift Return or Control Return on Mac. And this will now hide all the layers. And now I can show them again, and I can select any of the layers. I don't have to have the group clone layer selected, and then hit the shortcut to show clone layers. And now they're being shown, and it's also indicated which layers are being shown by this marker. And now I can come up to my drops effect, maybe add like hue and saturation. Then I can work on several layers, and when I'm finished, I'm just gonna hide my layers again, and it's being updated to the clone then. If you execute show clone layers, you see that we are showing the layers that this clone has, but we're not showing this drops texture here because it's one level even further. So I would have to hit show clone layers here. And now I can show that texture as well. You already know that you can enable or disable your layer, and it will, be linked by expression and live update. Similarly, you can also enable or disable your effects, but you can also solo them. So if I'm just soloing that layer, of course, I'm not seeing anything since this is at 0% opacity and I'm just seeing the group clone. However, if I'm going to hit refresh layout, workflow will automatically also solo the clone that the layer that is soloing right now is contained in. And then I can also add my other clone layers. And that way I can solo or unsolo them. If I'm not soloing anything, it will show the entire clone. So I have this shot here, this drone shot. And let's say we want to add a texture to that rooftop here. So I have tracked this. I did a 4-corner pin track with Mocha here. So let's bring in a texture here. So I have this grunge texture here, and let me just scale it down. I'm going to set the transform mode to multiply, and let's add some curves to it. Let's transform it a bit. All right, I'm going to put this into a group. Okay, and now I want to apply the 4-corner pin track to it. In order to do that, everything has to be fit to the comp size. So I'm just going to create a group clone from this texture group. And in this case, I want to enable the prime clone. And I also want to enable the Precomp transforms, but I'm going to disable it now to show you basically the difference. So let us first set the clone to multiply as well. And if we look at the transforms, we see that they're all locked. Even if I would want to move the Precomp, I couldn't do it. And this is so you don't move it by accident. However, if I enable the Precomp transforms and I hit refresh connections, we see that now we can move it around. And also another cool thing, we see that this layer here that is contained in there has been parented to the clone. So we can move it around, rotate it, whatever. And this layer will always be at the right position here because it is parented to the group clone. This, however, only works with 2D layers. If you have a 3D layer, the position will be off. It only will work if you have the Z position set at 0. That layers will be parented to the clone only is the case when you use prime clones. When you use regular Precomp clones, you can enable the Precomp transforms, but the contained layers just won't be parented to it. Alright, now we're ready to apply the corner pin to our group clone. So I'm going to select it, apply it, enable the motion blur. And now we see that it matches and it's tracked in. Now let's quickly create a mat for it. And I want to apply the corner pin also to that. Now we can just roto it. And we see now it all works perfectly. And at any point in time, we see we have our texture here and we can move it. And we can also very easily now add another texture to it. So now I'm dropping this texture into it. And let me just show the layers now. Okay, let's scale it down and add some curves to it. And now what we have to do now is hit refresh connections. And since it is a group clone, it automatically added this layer to our clone. So let's hide our layers again and show the Precomp clone. Alright, and now we have added another element. What you can also do is set a custom size for your Precomp clone. So what I have here in our background is the stage. And then I have this guitar guy, which I keyed out. And now I want to create a shadow that's coming from these lights. So what I'm going to do is duplicate that layer. And what I want to do with that is use a corner pin effect. However, with the corner pin effect in After Effects, it's kind of annoying because there are no from pins. And this is a bit larger actually. So it would be kind of messy having to fiddle with that. What you can do, for example, is create a Precomp and make the Precomp smaller and then use the corner pin effect on that. Well, let me just call that shadow base. And now I'm going to create a Precomp clone. I want the prime clone to be enabled and also the Precomp transforms. And now it's been fit to the comp size. However, I want the Precomp size to be a custom size. And then you can go into the custom precomp size settings. And in order to know how big the new precomp is going to be, I'm going to come up with the settings, hold on Alt or Option, and then you can click on Preview Custom Clone Size. And now, if I move those parameters, you see that I'm getting, an indication of how big this precomp is going to be, so that it fits right around that guy. And then if we hit Refresh Connections, you see that this precomp now has this new size. Okay, now let's move our guy on top. Now I'm going to grab my shadow here and move it into place. I'm going to reverse it, and then I'm going to grab my power pin. Now I'm going to add a fill to it, and I'm going to set it to multiply. I'm going to call this left shadow. Then I'm going to create the right shadow, so duplicate that, and I'm going to delete the settings and the cloned layer effect, so I can make it a dependent clone. Alright, looking good so far, I think. Of course, this part here would need a little bit more work. So another thing I would like to do now is to create some displacement here, that the background is kind of displacing that shadow. So in order to do that, we will have to create a precomp clone from the whole background. And I don't want the prime clone or the precomp transforms to be enabled this time. So I'm going to disable that. I'm going to duplicate it and remove all my settings. And I'm going to call this Luma Matte. And then I can customize it a bit. Basically try to grab as much of the structure here, so we get a lot of information for displacement. Now I'm going to disable that. I also, of course, have to create a precomp clone from these two here. So I'm going to grab these two layers here, create a precomp clone. This time I want the prime clone to be enabled, but no precomp transforms this time. I have to set the blending mode to multiply as well. And then I can create a displacement map. Select this Luma Matte here. And maybe create a Gaussian blur to it a bit. And maybe also to the matte itself. Now maybe we'll have to move these two ones a bit down here. Alright, certainly it doesn't win an award for best visual effects as of now, but you see that it was fairly simple to do all of that using precomp clones. Alright, now I want to show you a different mode of cloning, which is called clone in comp, and it has some advantages and also some disadvantages compared to a precomp clone. I have this example here of this also immensely beautiful comp, of course. And it's this triangle going around these cubes. And these cubes are generated by CC Particle World. This triangle should be in front of the particles at first, and then it's supposed to be behind that. But because this is a 2.5D effect, this 3D layer won't interact with that, and it cannot go behind that. What you could do now, for example, is create a clone and comp. And a clone and comp only works on single layers. So you cannot clone multiple layers. You can come up to the main menu, hold on Shift, and then go to clone and comp. And then you can use the RGBA or the alpha only. I'm going to select RGBA, and I don't want to split source and clone at the current time right now. And now I have created this perfect clone of this triangle here. And the cool thing about a clone and comp is that I can add any effect to it. Or even if I add a mask to it. So let me just look at the clone, and you see all of these things have been updated to that. So everything that you add with effects will update automatically. So I don't have to hit refresh connections anymore, which is pretty cool. And this is just like a general calculations effect on it. And it will have inherited all the transforms of the other layer. But there's still a need for refresh connections. So let's say I want to enable motion blur. This of course cannot be replicated, so I would have to hit refresh connection, and as you can see, now the blur also has been created there. The same goes for a parent. If I would want to parent that, then I would have to hit refresh connections again, and now the clone also has this parent. So I'm just going to delete that for now because I want to use a different setting. So I'm going to go to the part where this triangle has to go behind these boxes. So it should be somewhere around here. Then I can also just use the shortcut, which is Shift N. I'm going to select RGBA again, but I'm going to select split source and clone at current time. And then I'm going to set it to split source by opacity. And now this clone here has been created with the in point at where, the current time is. And then I can just move it behind the particles. And then if I go to the main layer here and I look at the opacity, it will be set to 0. And if I go one frame before that, it's 100. And that way, which is pretty cool, now first of all, you see it's going behind that because of course the clone, this is the one that's being visible here. But the cool thing is, just because it's been this layer only has been set to 0% opacity, but it's still enabled, I can still move it around and switch things up on there. And it will live update on the clone layer that is being visible here. And if I want to change the in point of that, for example, to maybe here, then I have to grab these keyframes here and move them right there. And now it will work without a problem. Another time when cloning in comp might be really useful is when you want to use it as a track mat. In this case, I want to create like a light edge for that guitar guy here. Go to clone and comp. I'm going to select alpha only, and I don't want to split source and clone at the current time right now. And now we have this perfect mat. And this time it's just using the set mat effect. And then I want to duplicate that actually again. And I'm going to set the fill to, some color here. And then I want to set this to alpha inverted. And I'm going to grab a transform effect here and position that down. Maybe add like a Gaussian blur to it. Set it to add maybe. If you reveal the opacity for a clone and comp, this cannot be manipulated because there is an expression applied to it. And this is because when you come to the source of the clone, you will also have these clone and comp settings here. And you can set the clone opacity, for example. You can say it's custom on each clone. And you will also have this slider up here. So I can set it to 50 maybe, or even lower. And in this case, you can also use the reveal layer opacity shortcut. And then you can set the opacity for this specific clone. Or if you have multiple clones, you can set maybe custom for all clones if you want to. And then you can control all of your clones. But in this case, I don't want that because this one is supposed to be at 100, of course, and this one at 25. So I'm just going to set it to custom on each clone. And the cool thing is that now everything is linked to that base layer. So let's say I'm creating like a mask here. Of course, that doesn't make sense at all. But you see that this light edge will react to that automatically. So there are different ways of refreshing connections. You already know the regular refresh connections. So I'm coming up to this layer here again, and I want to add some levels, for example. Of course, it won't show up here, and then I'm going to hit refresh connections. However, as you see, this takes a little bit of time. And this is because the way refresh connections works is that it will go into the group clone, delete all of the layers, copy all of the layers back into the comp and link them up. So there's also a different mode. So I'm just going to delete that. Let's say I'm adding it again. And if I come up to the menu and hold on Shift, I can click on Quick Refresh Connections. And as you see, it's way faster, because the way quick refresh connection works is that it won't delete all of the layers. It will keep them within the clone, but it will check every layer for its attributes, and whether something changed, then it will update that layer to that new state. In most cases, it should be faster. However, let's say you changed 100 parameters or something, then it could be that it's slower because it has to change all of these parameters then. However, there are also a few drawbacks to quick refresh connections. That's why it's not the default way to refresh connections. That's why it's just for users that know what they're doing. Quick refresh connections will be able to refresh most of the attributes, all of the data that's inside an effect here, for example. However, with these layer indexes, so this one will work, but this drop down here, the source mask, effects and masks drop down, unfortunately, you cannot access that via scripting, so the function won't know whether anything changed there. That's why when you hit quick refresh connections, always the selected layers, they will be copied into the clone comp completely and linked up, and all of the other layers that are not selected will be checked for their changes, like I explained. So when you have an effect like this here, this is a problem, but also when you have effects, for example, that have like a unique UI, like let's say Element 3D or optical flares or something, this also won't be readable by quick refresh connections. If you come up to the user guide and you go to connections, then you go to quick refresh connections, you can also read up on the drawbacks to it. But for everyone that wants to refresh and refresh quicker and that knows what they're doing, I would always recommend quick refresh connections. There's also a shortcut for it, so I'm going to delete that and I want to update that layer. So I'm going to hit Alt F2, or on Mac it's Control 2. And there's an even quicker way to refresh your connections than using quick refresh connections, and that is the quick refresh connections that is built into refresh layout. Alright, now it all gets quite confusing. That's why this option isn't enabled by default. But if you're interested, you can come up to the settings, go to cloning, and here's this option. When executing refresh layout, quick refresh clone connections of selected layers. So you can check that. Hit save. So what will it do? It's basically quick refresh connections, but whereas the other refresh connections will always update the entire clone comp, this time only the selected layer will be refreshed and nothing else. However, in most cases, I would say this is what you want. You make a little change, you add an effect, you change the blending mode, and you want to see the result. And then you can just execute refresh layout. Let's just add curves here, for example. I'm going to hit refresh layout, and now it's already there. I can delete it, hit refresh layout. I can change the blending mode of that, and then it's already there. But the drawback, of course, is, let's say you work on several layers here and you forget to execute refresh layout, and then you're just executing it, while on that layer. And then you have these other two layers that have not been refreshed, and you're wondering why is the clone not updating correctly. There's also one other drawback to this function, and it has to do with the drawback I already covered within quick refresh connections. I told you that within the regular quick refresh connections, the selected layer will always be copied to the clone comp and linked up completely. However, this is not the case with the quick refresh connections within refresh layout, just to keep it as fast as possible. So just be aware that this drop-down source, masks, effects and masks might not update correctly. Let's say you're experiencing some difficulty, something isn't updating correctly. I would always advise you to use the regular refresh connections then once, and then everything will be updated, and after that you can continue using your quick refresh connections. If you look into the user guide and you go to layout, you can also go to quick refresh clone connections of selected layers within the refresh layout function, and there you can also read up a bit about its limitations. Another thing you can do with Precomp clones is you can create 3D Precomp clones. This, as of now, is in beta, so there are some drawbacks. So I would just refer to the user guide, go to cloning, go to 3D Precomp clones, and it tells you that there are quite a few drawbacks. They're also not enabled by default, but if you still want to use them, just come up to the main menu, go to cloning, and click on use 3D Precomp clones. I'm going to hit save. And this only applies to prime clones. So if I just create a prime clone, and also another important thing is it has to have its Precomp transforms enabled. And then I'm gonna click on the 3 layer switch for the clone, and I'm gonna hit refresh connections. And as you can see, the contained layers all have been turned into 3D. And if we look at the position of them, we see that the Z position for all of these layers has been set to 0. This is so that we can grab our comp here, scale it for example, shift it back, and we can't really move them in the Z position because they're of course stuck to this plane that is the Precomp clone. And now we can just move it around and also of course move them in the X and Y position. If you want to rotate them, it is important to set your rotation not to orientation, because the orientation also is locked because we're just using the 2D rotation, which is the Z rotation. So always set it to rotation. If you were to have your collapse transformation switch enabled, and I hit refresh connections, now we can also move them in the Z position. And we have our Precomp clone here and can move it around and still work on our layers here. If I disable that again and I hit refresh connections, they're all locked again in the Z position. Sometimes you may want to have the collapse transformation switch enabled, sometimes not. Let's say I'm adding a roughen edges effect on here. I crank it up and then I move it around. That stays in place. However, if I enable the collapse transformation switch, we have to turn it down a bit more. If we move it around, the structure itself will not move with the layers.